I have a phobia that goes by a few names: scopophobia or athmophobia, the fear of being watched. What this means is that I have this strange compulsion. Whenever I see a doorway, a window, or virtually any surface where someone could hide, I imagine a face peering out at me, staring. I imagine what I would do, what I could do, and soon you'll understand why I have this phobia. So, here's the story. I'll try my best to recall all the details, though my mind has repressed much of it. Around June of 2016, my mother and I were living in a small apartment. There was no basement or attic, but in the closet floor of my bedroom there was one tiny crawl space. I never looked inside. Some people might have been overwhelmed with curiosity, but my imagination had already filled it with the worst possibilities. I decided to leave whatever dead bodies or ghosts were down there for the next tenant. It was a nice apartment, small but perfect for the two of us. We lived there peacefully for a few months until the noises started. At first, it was nothing extreme, just the occasional bump in the night, especially scratching sounds. My mum brushed it off as rats in the walls. As long as they stayed inside, I wasn't too concerned. A week or two later, I had grown used to the noises. They almost became comforting. You never liked silence. That is, until one night I woke to a different sound. A rolling noise, eerily similar to the sound of my closet door sliding open. I cracked my eyes open and looked over, but in the dark, I couldn't make anything out. I thought maybe I saw something move, but I knew how easily the mind plays tricks in the dark. There was only one way to find out. I turned on my lamp. I expected to see nothing more than a closet full of coats, but instead I saw something far worse, and not just an eye, but half of someone's face, barely visible through the tiny crack he had opened. He didn't react to being caught. No smile, no fear, just watching. My heart had never beaten faster. I wished I had screamed, or maced him, or done something. But I just sat frozen, staring back until I broke down sobbing. I think I tried to ask, "What do you want?" But my crying garbled the words. He opened the door wider, revealing his entire body. I won't describe him. I've spent years trying to forget that face. He simply said, "She." Hearing his voice made it real. I couldn't pretend this was some hallucination anymore. I pressed my back against the wall as he cheerfully added, "It's okay." That false cheer still gives me chills. That was when I finally had the courage to run out of the room. This creep even knew my name. My name, my mum, half asleep, called the police while I cried uncontrollably. She thought I had imagined it. But by the time officers arrived, he was gone. All that remained was that damn crawl space. I never looked inside, but part of me wishes I had. Proof would have shown I wasn't crazy. Apparently, he had been living in there. For how long, no one knew. Officers said there were tally marks inside the crawl space. I didn't want to know whether they were counting days or weeks. I just wanted out of that apartment. Eventually, we moved. Police never found him. They thought they'd caught a homeless man matching the description, but he was unresponsive. They dismissed him as a squatter. Even when I told them he knew my name, they assumed he'd overheard it through the floorboards. Since that night, his face has been the one I imagine whenever I see an open door or closet. Over time, it's grown more distorted, but I can always see his pursed lips still shushing me, even now. It's gotten easier, but I don't think it will ever leave me completely. TV shows and movies often depict abductors driving white or black vans. I never thought much of it until I bought one myself, a white 1994 Dodge Ram cargo van to haul gear for work. While driving it, I've been pulled over and searched by police 3 separate times for no reason. But that's another story. The point is, some people see vans as automatically suspicious. One day, as I drove slowly through my neighborhood because of speed bumps and the delicate, expensive gear in the back, I noticed a woman pushing a stroller. She stared at me with wide, fearful eyes the entire time. To ease the tension, I smiled like a friendly neighbor, but she was staring so intently that she nearly pushed her stroller off the curb. I chuckled to myself and soon forgot about it. A week later, our HOA email thread erupted. A resident warned that his wife and toddler were being stalked by a man in a white van, fearing the neighborhood would mistake me for the creeper. I replied to all, I lived here, I drove a white van, and here were my license plate number and home address. A big mistake, I know, half jokingly. I added that I had also seen a suspicious person in the neighborhood, woman with a stroller staring at me so hard it made me uncomfortable. I even gave the date and time. Turns out, the supposed stalker was me. The husband went ballistic. He started sending email after email, CCING, everyone, claiming he could read between the lines. His accusations grew more absurd by the day and turned into personal attacks. Luckily, several neighbors replied that he was out of line. Eventually, the emails stopped. But then things took a stranger turn, on several occasions. While I was out walking my dog, a 10-year-old girl would rush over awkwardly to chat. She gave me oddly personal details about her life. It felt inappropriate, but I assumed she just knew me from the neighborhood, so I politely responded. One day, she showed up at my house. She said she was upset because her dad wouldn't let her have a dog like mine, so she wanted to visit mine. I told her I would need to speak with her parents first. She agreed and left. After that, I never saw her again. Later, I learned the truth. I have 2 daughters, and one of their friends revealed that this girl was the daughter of the angry HOA man. Apparently, he had been sending her out to talk to me and take photos. She was uncomfortable with it and confided in her friend, which is how I found out. Her father was using his own daughter as bait, trying to manufacture some kind of evidence against me. Fortunately, I had dash cams in all my vehicles and CCTV at my front door. The incident with his wife, as well as his daughter's visit to my house, were both recorded. I emailed him, kindly offering copies of the videos. I also expressed concern that his daughter's behavior, approaching strangers alone, was unsafe. That seemed to end things. I never heard from him again. I grew up in a village near Munich in southern Germany. It was one of the safest and most peaceful places imaginable, with a few young families escaping the high rents of the city and several elderly couples. Close to my parents' house, there was a small nature conservation area, maybe 2 or 3 square kilometers in size, with a forest and a few little lakes. Entrance wasn't forbidden, but since there were no trails leading deeper inside and the area was overgrown and wet, hardly anyone ventured far. I, however, loved wild and natural places. Once I was old enough to play outside alone, I began exploring it, and soon it became my favorite playground. One day, if I remember correctly, I was 9. I discovered a small clearing deep in the forest, covered in a meadow of flowers. In late summer, it honestly looked like paradise. Over the years, I went there whenever I wanted to be alone, to read, dream, draw, and, as I grew older, sunbathe. I never told anyone about it, and I never saw a single sign of another person there. It was my secret, and I felt safe. Years later, I returned one afternoon to read and sunbathe. Since I never saw anyone there, I usually stayed topless. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, I nearly screamed. Sitting directly beside me was a man maybe 50 years old, about 1.8 meters tall, wearing light outdoor clothes and with a camera hanging around his neck. I panicked and tried to cover myself, but my clothes were out of reach. All I could do was press myself against the ground. He just sat there, staring at me. He told me how beautiful I was and how glad he was to see me again. I asked him to turn around so I could get dressed, but he refused, saying, "No, you don't need to be ashamed. I just want to chat a little." He asked about my life, where I lived, my name, how school was going, whether there were boys I liked. At first, I gave short answers, hoping he would leave, but he clearly had no intention of going. After a few minutes, he asked if I would let him take some pictures because I looked like a nymph and he wanted to preserve me forever. I refused instantly. That was when his demeanor shifted. His face hardened, and in a cold, creepy voice I'll never forget, he said, "You know, you really are stupid for a naked little girl all alone in the forest." At that, I was terrified. I leapt up and ran into the woods, leaving all my belongings behind. He didn't follow. Instead, he just sat there and laughed. After 2 hours of hiding, I cautiously returned. He was gone. Most of my things were still there, but my t-shirt and bikini top were missing. I grabbed everything else, tried to cover myself with my skirt, and ran home as fast as I could. I never told my parents, but I never visited that meadow again. I grew up in a nice little neighborhood where all the families knew each other, the kids played together, and we all went to the same school. As long as we were home before the streetlights came on, we were free to roam. We recognized everyone who lived nearby. There was one man, though, who stood out. He was well known in the area, always rolling down the streets in his wheelchair. He lived only a few houses down. He had his own group of friends and never really interacted with us. He gave me a strange vibe, but never a reason not to trust him. One day, when I was around 6 and my sister about 10, we were riding our bikes down our street. The man in the wheelchair turned the corner toward us. My gut told me something was off, so I told my sister to ride ahead. He rolled faster, calling out that he needed help. I told him we couldn't help and needed to get home. He kept insisting, "Please, I really need help." Then, to my horror, he stood up. Out of the wheelchair, he started running after us. We jumped off our bikes and sprinted home, screaming for our dad. My dad and older cousin stormed down to his house, where he was sitting outside with friends again. My dad shouted at us to stay inside. What happened next, I only learned later. My dad pistol whipped the man and warned him never to look in our direction again. After that, whenever he saw us, he would quickly roll to the other side of the street. I'm from Kentucky, a place full of wooded areas where people love their guns. I never really believed in strange creatures lurking in the forest. Bigfoot maybe, but I doubted it. That is, until something happened that changed my mind forever. Had just bought my first AR-15 style rifle, a Ruger AR-556, along with a 60-round drum magazine. A few days later, I decided to take it out and sight it in. Our land was mostly thick, forestry quarters of it, at least. The cows had carved out some narrow trails, and I followed one along a creek toward a large grazing field where I usually tested my guns when the cows weren't there. As soon as I crossed into the field, I felt watched. At first, I brushed it off, since I'd walked that path 1,000 times without issue. But the feeling grew more intense the farther I went, as though I was getting closer to whatever was watching me. Halfway there, the sensation was unbearable. I stopped and began loading the drum magazine. I only brought 20 rounds since I was just sighting in the rifle, but that should have been enough. As soon as I started loading, I smelled something rotten, like a carcass baking in the sun. I looked around, and behind me was what was left of a possum torn apart. It looked fresh, maybe a day old, but the smell was far more decomposed. It was almost as if it had been placed there for me to find. Uneasy, I loaded faster. In hindsight, I should have taken that possum as a warning to turn back. But I pressed on near the end of the creek, just as the feeling of being watched became overwhelming. I heard a splash. I spun toward the noise, rifle ready, and saw it. A creature I'll never forget. It was at least 8 feet tall, probably taller, but impossibly thin, like a 120-pound man stretched out without gaining any width. Its skin was light brown, stretched tightly over its frame. Its arms were long, and it walked on 2 legs, splashing silently in the creek. Its gait was strange, almost a waddle, yet it covered ground quickly. I steadied my rifle, but when I hit, the bolt released a chamber around. The bullet jammed. The first round, usually the easiest, wouldn't budge. That magazine, brand new, had never worked again afterward. The creature turned and slipped away into the woods. No running, no sound, just gone. Later, a friend and I compared my description to legends. Everything fit the Wendigo. Tall and thin, foul stench of death. Fast, violent, toward animals. Sometimes light brown in color. The torn possum, the smell, the presence, it all matched. But there was one inconsistency. Wendigos are supposed to be aggressive, yet this one only watched. It didn't attack. Why, I've returned to that field many times since, but I've never felt watched like that day again. Whatever it was real. No one can convince me otherwise. This happened a couple of years ago when I was about 9 or 10. I was on the beach with my family and a friend of mine's family. She was around 11 or 12 at the time. At some point, the two of us wandered away from our families and were just playing around on the sand. We decided to explore the nearby area and ended up in a secluded spot within a forest, maybe 5 or 10 minutes away from where our parents were. There, we met a man, probably in his mid to late 30s. When he saw us, he smiled and walked toward us. We didn't think much of it at first. He started a conversation by saying, "Hey there, I'm a photographer for a modeling agency, and I couldn't help but notice you two would be perfect for a photo shoot." He went on about how pretty my friend was and told us that if we agreed to the shoot, we would make a lot of money. At first, we were excited and told him we just needed to make sure it was okay with our parents. That's when things got strange. He said we shouldn't tell our parents anything and should just follow him. It wasn't far from there. He kept repeating how much money we'd make if we just went with him quietly. My friend quickly grew skeptical. She told him we weren't interested, grabbed my hand, and started to walk away. He followed, raising his voice, continuing to promise money if we just came with him. That was when my friend squeezed my arm tightly and we both bolted. He stopped following us, but when I glanced back, he was standing still, glaring at us with an annoyed expression. We ran straight to our families and told them everything. Some of the adults went to check, but of course, he was gone. Back in 2014, I was 17, blonde, average build, angsty, and rebellious. My best friend and I were at Argos, a UK store that sells furniture, home goods, toys, and more. Think of it like a cheaper version of IKEA. I was wearing shorts with tights underneath, partly to prevent chafing. My friend and I were browsing when a tall man who smelled strongly of beer walked up. He loudly introduced himself with a strange name and shook my hand. We both thought it was odd, so we ignored him and walked away. Later, while we were waiting in line, I noticed him muttering something under his breath in a language I didn't recognize. He eventually left, and we were relieved. But not long after, I suddenly felt something wet on the back of my leg. I turned round and there he was, rising up from behind me. The man had licked my tattoo through my tights. I was horrified, frozen in disgust. He just walked away casually, as though nothing had happened. The store assistant immediately called the police, while I phoned my boyfriend in hysterics. The next day, police officers came to my house. They even asked for a DNA swab. Luckily, I still had the tights I was wearing, and they collected them as evidence. About a week later, they contacted me again. The man had been arrested. Apparently, he had licked several women in public and was sentenced to 6 months in jail, plus community service. It still chills me to think what could have happened if I had been alone that day. When I was 14, I worked at a horseback riding barn. The man who owned it was a bit odd, but I loved being around the horses and didn't pay much attention. One day, while I was brushing one of the mares, he came up behind me and started talking casually about how women and horses are very similar. I didn't really know what he meant, so I just nodded and kept brushing. Then he said, "They both need a firm hand. You have to know when to be gentle and when to be rough." His tone made me uncomfortable. I decided to put the brush down and leave the store. But before I could, he reached out, stroked my arm, and whispered, "You'll understand when you're older." I froze. I wanted to scream, but instead, I just walked out as fast as I could. I told my mum that night, and she immediately pulled me from the barn. Later, we found out that other girls had complained about him too. Eventually, he was investigated and lost his business to this day. I can't be around someone who talks like that without feeling sick. When I was about 8 years old, I loved to go exploring in the woods behind my grandparents' house. They lived in a rural area, and the forest felt endless to me back then. One summer afternoon, I wandered farther than usual and found a small clearing with an old wooden shack in the middle. The windows were covered, and the door was slightly open. Curious, I walked closer. Inside, I could see furniture, an old chair, a table, and what looked like blankets on the floor. It was clear that someone had been living there. As I leaned in to get a better look, I heard a voice behind me. "Do you like my house?" I spun around, and there was a man standing only a few feet away. He was tall, dirty, with tangled hair and a wild look in his eyes. I stammered something about being sorry, but he stepped closer and said, "You can come inside if you want. I like having visitors." I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my grandparents' house. I told my grandpa, and he called the police. They found the shack abandoned, but there were signs someone had been staying there for a while, for years. I refused to go into the woods alone. A few years ago, when I was around 20, I was walking home from work late at night. It was only about a 15-minute walk, and I usually felt safe since the neighborhood was quiet. That night though, I noticed a man behind me. At first, I thought it was just coincidence, lots of people walked that route. But every time I turned, he was still there, keeping the same pace. I sped up. He sped up. I slowed down. He slowed down. My heart was pounding. I crossed the street, so did he. Finally, I pulled out my phone, pretended to call someone, and said loudly, "Yeah, I'll see you in a minute, can you meet me at the corner?" The man stopped walking. He stood under a streetlight, watching me. Then he slowly turned and walked back the way he came. I never saw him again. I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't faked that phone call.